This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this!
Hello, and welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. Thank you for joining us for this Patron Roundtable discussion of Hybrid X-Files, those episodes that combine elements of the mythology and standalone episodes. I'm joined today by our patrons Katie Doe and Deana Ferreri for part 2 of this roundtable discussion, in which we focus on the themes and visuals of Mytharc to be found in standalone Monster of the Week episodes. Hello, Katie, and welcome.
Hi.
Hey, Deana, how are you?
Hey, Marlene. I'm good.
We've talked a little bit about how to proceed through the discussion, given the large number of ideas we've all had about the Mytharc connections within the independent standalone episodes. So what we've decided to do is to each choose a few episodes and themes to present, and then follow those with honorable mention moments of visuals and thematic elements, and then have a few discussions of some of the episodes that are not necessarily mythology and not necessarily standalone, but kind of point back to the mythology, such as Jose Chung's From Outer Space. And we'll also have a little time for some listener mailbag comments. So we're going to go ahead and start with you, Deana.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with the black oil, and specifically how the black oil shows up in someone's eyes, so that's how you know they're being controlled by it, which I've always thought is a really scary visual. The black oil is supposed to be the original inhabitant of the planet, which, like, it makes a lot of sense that it's an oil, you know, like a fossil fuel, something very old. So I was thinking of, there are a few other episodes where there's a visual where the monster's eyes, someone's eyes tell us that this is the monster. So the first one would be Squeeze. It's almost like halfway through the episode where you actually see this. But there's this scene where he's already been questioned. They've already done the polygraph test, and I think he's sort of like lurking and like waiting to find his next victim. And there's this shot of him, and he's sort of in the shadows, but there's like a little bit of light, and you just see his eyes, and they're that yellow that they weren't before, and that's sort of how you know, oh, this really is the guy. Never Again is another one where when the tattoo, when Betty the tattoo is going to murder somebody, her winked eye opens up.
Oh, yeah.
See, I never actually noticed that before.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that, because I noticed that like 2 months ago. I was watching it, like, and it's one of my, like, favorites. I was about to record an episode of the podcast with Darren Mooney, which was awesome. It was so much fun. But anyway, I was preparing for that, and I was watching it and, like, had my pen and paper out, and I'm like, oh, the tattoo's eyes open. Like, never noticed this before.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, Bad Blood, actually, is another one. Everyone loves Bad Blood, but I like how they do the sort of, it's a very unconventional vampire. It's not, you know, there are many different kinds of vampires. It's not the vampire you would just think of as the standard. So they have, like, the glowing green eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's a really creepy visual, too, I find.
Yeah. Detour, the red, like, you just see the red eyes, like, you never actually see the monster, which really scared me the first time I saw it, which Katie probably remembers because she was there.
Oh, wow.
Hiding in the college dorm room.
Yes,
right.
I was like, I'm pretty sure I, like, had trouble
Check under the bed.
Terms of endearment also, I think the woman, the wife, the other wife, the wife who was actually the demon.
Yes.
I forget her name, but, like, at the end, like, she blinks and you see her eyes change to, like, these little, like, slits.
Mm-hmm.
That one too. Yeah, so there were actually a lot when I started thinking about it.
Well, that reminds me, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that reminds me of Dehan de Verletst with Mrs. Paget, when her eyes go to the snake eyes when she's sort of conjuring the girl to slit her wrist. And whenever she's doing anything that involves, you know, like sort of exercising her power, don't her eyes turn into snake eyes?
Yeah, they turn those little like slits again. Yeah.
Yeah, I missed that. I actually, I thought I remember that, and I went and watched it, but then like, I don't know, it was so dark. I had trouble finding it, but I also was like fast forwarding through the episode trying to find it. But yeah, that's so. I mean, that was it for the monsters, but I sort of wanted to bring just the theme of eyes back to the mythology, because something that popped into my head was in Anami. At the end of Anami, Scully is talking to Mulder, and she, about the Smoking Man, and she says to Mulder, "I looked into his eyes. I swore he was telling me the truth." Which is, of course, it's a very different thing, but it's sort of the opposite of the black oil. Like, she sort of feels like no matter what he has done in the past, no matter how terrible he is, she felt like she could look into his eyes and really, really see him. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that. The eyes are the window to the soul, so it's like
yes,
a really
window to the soul.
easy mechanism to like change them and then make someone feel really uncomfortable, like changing the color or changing the shape.
That's interesting too about singing someone's nature and how that, like, you're relating that to the black oil. It's almost like the black oil is occluding the real person's nature in the mythology.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I wonder too, like the idea of voyeurism. I watched Red Museum recently for this podcast, and I was thinking about the man that is sort of like a little bit of a red herring. I mean, he's kidnapping the kids, but he's not the one that's, murdering them. But there's a scene of him looking through the mirror when the light in the bathroom scene, when the light's reflected to his eyes, and all you see is the eyes. Yeah. And that is kind of, I thought that was a little bit of a voyeuristic example. And then also in Oubliette with the photographer, there are a lot of visuals of his eyes too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of comes up in Weremonster too, like with the eyes just poking through like in a comedic way, but it's still kind of creepy when you think of who's doing it.
Yeah.
Right, but that's interesting because he does say that he was himself again when he turns into the monster. That's his true nature. Yep.
Right. And it does sort of connect, like the idea of voyeurism, not exactly voyeurism, but more like surveillance does connect to the mythology, because I think I don't know if I think that's season 8 or 9 where Scully finds out that they've been surveilled for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. This is like a little bit of a tangent too, but I just thought of this from I Want to Believe, which I've told you both I like to mention as often as possible. But there's several parts in there. Like a lot of that has to do with like watching and vision, and then there's the blood, crying tears of blood, Father Joe crying tears of blood. And there's a scene on one of the monitors in the FBI, and it's just over to the side. It's later in the movie, but they show someone's eye, like almost an anatomical structure of an eye on there. And there's just a lot about vision and eyes and seeing clearly and things like that, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like throughout the show, you have a lot of those shots of, like someone's watching from a remote camera, like Gethsemane. You can see Mulder, seeing the screen, and then, like the eyes under the bed in Detour, and it's like a really effective way to get the viewer engaged, I think, and make them feel really uncomfortable.
Definitely.
But I would not have tied that necessarily back to the mythology, because I like that. I like the whole sort of the idea of, like you said, Katie, the eyes of being a window to the soul, but I wouldn't have necessarily thought about that in relation to the black oil.
Yeah, it was good.
Katie, do you want to do your first one?
Sure. So a big part of the mythology is the bounty hunter, and he's like the most famous shapeshifter in the X-Files. And that's kind of definitely a recurring theme throughout the mythology episodes. But one episode I wanted to talk about where he shows up again is the Unnatural, but it kind of takes the shape-shifting and turns it around a bit. I like the distinction between the bounty hunter using this power for evil. He can change into whatever form he wants to carry out his killing work. And I think that's the first time we ever know that he's really a gray underneath it, too. Like, I hadn't really thought of that before in my mind, that he would turn into a gray when he wasn't, like, in his human Terminator form.
Right.
So that's why I like the visual of Exley being a gray, too, but he's choosing to shapeshift into this form for good. He just wants to, be on this earth. He wants to have fun. He wants to laugh. He makes a note of saying, like, his race, they don't laugh, they don't have fun. Their mouths are very small, so they can't smile. So it comes from, like, this pure place, not for, like, harming or killing, like pretty much every other shape-shifting monster does out there. Like, that's kind of the theme. If you shape-shift, it's not a good thing. And I kind of like that Derry Mooney talks about it also as, like, a larger theme of the mythology is like the fear of conformity. Like the aliens want to colonize and make everyone, into workers' drones, like it's a globalized force. So I like that this is one of the members of that race who doesn't want that. He wants to blend in another way.
Yeah, and he says, doesn't he say like he doesn't want to be a famous man? He
just wants to be a man, yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it's the mythology story told kind of as a fairy tale with, he does die, but it's kind of a happy, uplifting ending because he reaches his goal. Like at the end, he is a man. He's bleeding red blood. He doesn't turn back into his form. He says, this is my true face, the face that he picked as Exley. Whereas the bounty hunter picks his face, he shows him his true alien face before he kills him. So I like that dichotomy, where it's a mythology story that's sneaking into this lovely little monster of the week.
Yeah, sort of like a fairy tale upending the mythology.
Yeah. Yep.
It seems like there's, like, with the shape-shifting, there's also, the show does a lot on doubling as well, which isn't the same thing, but I think there's, like, something about the dual nature to be found in that as well.
Yeah, like doubling clones,
Yeah.
It kind of runs all throughout the show, whether it's mythology or not. It kind of all ties back into that.
But you mentioned a few other episodes, too, I
so
know.
like Small Potatoes has Eddie Van Blunt shape-shifting, but that's, like, on purpose. It's to do harm. Folie à Deux has I don't know what you call it, like the giant zombie bug that shapeshifts into the man.
Right.
Also to do harm, and the bounty hunter obviously can do the same thing. The aliens can all do this, so it's like a force that is kind of upended in this one episode. I like that.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, in Small Potatoes, I think Mulder even mentions to Scully, like, we've seen something like this before.
We've both seen this, yeah. Yep.
Sort of, yeah. So, like, they actually really explicitly draw the connection there.
That's a nice little callback, too, yeah, because sometimes it can seem like there's no continuity between, this kind of sounds familiar, as a case that we've looked at before.
Right. I thought that was unusual, too, and I sometimes forget that, but that's a very pointed thing that he does that connects it.
Yeah, it's a nice callback. It's such a big theme that runs throughout the show, like you said, also with, like, doubling and clones and all that.
And it's one of my favorite themes, too, and I don't know why, because that extends beyond the X-Files, but I've always been fascinated by shape-shifting. I guess it doesn't really happen, but I've always been interested in it. So whenever that happens, and I think it has to do, like what we were talking about, like with the sort of like having different natures and then like seeing someone's true face, like that kind of thing as well, like becoming something else, like Exley did in Unnatural.
Yeah, like it kind of comes up in like Shapes and Weremonster, like it's kind of a different thing, the whole werewolf idea, but it's the same thing, like the dual nature of someone and if they can choose or not what to sort of portray to the world.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, I'll do my first one. So mine is the theme of things that are buried or unearthed. And I thought of this leading into the end of season 2, leading into season 3, with the boxcar in the desert that's unearthed at the beginning. It starts the Anasazi trilogy. And then also to Scully's repressed memory of her abduction experience. And then a lot of the things that have to do with history being unearthed in the 3rd season. And in looking through those episodes that happened around that time, I'm going to say between Scully's abduction and then it kind of going into season 3, it seems like there are a lot of them that involve digging or something that's in the ground. Like I was thinking about Aubrey, which I'd also like to talk about a lot. There's a lot there just both with like memory and, sort of like consciousness being passed among generations and memory being sort of a shared thing through generations. So, they go into the genetic basis of that, which is not really scientifically accurate, I guess, but there is scientific history to those ideas that I find very interesting. And also just the, finding the bodies in the ground and then digging the bodies out of the ground, and a lot of it's very subterranean. Irresistible was another one. They're digging bodies up, and they're digging bodies up in fresh bones. Firewalker has Firewalker kind of in that subterranean volcano, to Hand of Verletzt. Even Endgame with the conning tower and Dead Calm, Humbug, they're digging up the potato, Our Town, they found the bones that they dug up. So it's like, I was going through this and I was kind of overwhelmed by how many there are in season 2. And I went back and looked at other seasons, like maybe they're just digging all the time, but it really seems to be that period of time. So I don't know if that was something that was latent in the writers' minds when they were going into writing those standalone episodes, and then it kind of came out and what they were more consciously maybe developing in the mythology. But I like that stretch of episodes because of that, I think, because there's some feel to it that then comes out later. And then that's what I pulled from it, was there's a lot of sort of unearthing things that are either literal or like metaphors from memory.
Yeah, it's like the whole unearthing the truth. Like the truth is out there. You have to go and dig it up and find it. Yeah.
Right. Maybe it's under there.
Yeah.
It is under there. I like that. It's a good slogan. We'll have to change it. We can go on if we want to your second, Deana, unless you have anything else on that.
Okay. Yeah, this one's my comedy one, which is War of the Copperphages as a what if the bees carrying the virus actually were released and like how the public would react. This is a comedic version of that, sort of. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking specifically of the one scene in the gas station convenience store where Scully goes in and everyone is like looting and, the two women are fighting over the pesticide. And it's funny because as the viewer, that they're not really in danger, or you're pretty sure they're not really in danger from cockroaches. But you could also look at that as if the bees were released. Well, actually, it'd probably look a lot like that, or a lot like I Struggle Too.
Yeah, definitely. That came to mind.
Yeah, definitely. That's true.
But I thought something that was interesting because War of the Copperphages come before you hear anything about bees, because it's season 3, and I think the first time you see the bees is in Herrenvolk when Mulder's talking to the sheriff. He's having his hand bandaged up because he was cut by the metal cockroach, and the sheriff is really concerned, trying to figure out what's going on, and he talks about how the USDA has set up some research facility, nobody knows what's going on, and he says, killer bees were a genetic experiment gone awry, let loose on an unsuspecting populace. Who's to say the government hasn't created a new breed of killer cockroaches? And it's almost like comedic foreshadowing.
Yeah, definitely.
Of the bees.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I love that. I like the parallel, and I like that it happened before. I think that's
right.
Sort of a psychic comedic gift there that Darren Morgan must have.
Yeah, and who knows if one of the other writers happened to be watching that and said, bees.
Yeah, like...
maybe we could do something.
What else can swarm around and infect the populace very quickly?
Scare people.
Because, with the gas station, the panic travels so fast. It's only, a matter... It's, a day and a half in the town, and suddenly the town has just gone nuts.
Well, I love that you brought that out, because I think there's a lot of discussion on War of the Worlds being the impetus for that, and I think it's possible that people just think, we look and say, oh, well, this is based on War of the Worlds, and he just did it with cockroaches. Yeah. But then that leaves out that sort of future forward aspect of this actually did happen on the show, and it probably inspired it somehow. So.
Yeah, instead of being a manufactured alien force, they're using the natural force of bees.
Right. Katie, do you want to do your second?
Sure. So my other one was, this kind of falls into plot line as well, but government experimentation, taking the public, violating them, using whatever force they can. They don't care. They get what they want as a result of testing, and then you're just sort of discarded. Kind of the theme of the government just doing whatever it wants, the shadow conspiracy doing whatever it wants. So something that came to mind, besides Nisei 731, Anasazi, and all of those, Sleepless kind of comes to mind as well as another. Augustus Cole and his fellow soldiers they were created. The government was just testing, and the military trying to, develop a better soldier. And it kind of brings to mind also the super soldier later on. They're looking for a more unstoppable force. It's not the same thing, but it's that idea. And then they're just discarded. They're forgotten, discarded. Their lives are ruined. They don't really care. So it's just that idea. And then the soldiers come back and try and exact revenge. I like the idea of that just carries through all the mythology, and it goes through a lot of episodes as well.
Yeah, and the experimentation and so forth. I think it's interesting too. The ones you mentioned have all been about creating something that's separate or better, or doesn't need sleep, or doesn't have the sort of is not natural.
Right.
And that goes back, I think, to your previous example with the shape-shifting, the difference in the unnatural and Josh Exley wanting to be normal and having those normal human flaws and frailties rather than being this super alien.
Right, something that's super engineered, yeah.
Yeah, so that engineering part of it, I think, is really interesting too.
Yeah, I think it's like just because in this episode also like Krychek appears, Mr. X appears, so it's kind of like a lot of like mythology stuff is contained in there, but it's kind of the overarching theme of the government military will do whatever it wants, and who cares what happens to the little people, the public.
Okay. Following off on that with the experimentation, thinking about, I'm going to go to one of my later examples, which was hybridization. I'm going to bring up, I Want to Believe, I hope for the last time. That was one of my examples, though. So, in I Want to Believe, we have this idea. It's, a lot of people didn't care for it because it didn't have, any connection to the mythology story. And I think some people are expecting that maybe from the trailers and the teasers and so forth that went out. But I think there's a lot in there that's sort of symbolic, and a lot of that has to do with hybridization. So you have the whole idea of the man's head being grafted onto female bodies, which, although, to me, is really kind of unpleasant visually, the idea of that, I think, is interesting and kind of goes with, creating this dual being that's going to be, healthy and better. And then also, the kidnapper, there's a part in it when they show that he hybridized his truck by adding a plow to the front of it that actually causes it to break down. So it's like a part added that doesn't belong. And then when it breaks down, there's oil, but it's green oil, so it's like unburnt oil that spews out of it. So I felt like that was a visual reference to the green, blood that sort of resulted from this attempt at hybridization. And then it also goes with the green liquid that Cheryl Cunningham, one of the kidnapped victims, is submerged in when they're going to cut off her head. So, again, an unpleasant part, but I thought that the green liquid in that sort of as a symbolism of hybridization was interesting. And I'm going to briefly connect that also then to Field Trip, which has, the green substance in the mushroom that's sort of dripping down the walls that we see at the end when Mulder and Scully are sort of psychically communicating with each other in there. And then also that they keep seeing, or Mulder keeps seeing in his visions when we, find out that he's actually submerged in the mushroom at that time. And it's sort of just a sign of, I don't know, infestation or illness or something that's not meant to go together maybe. And then there's also the scene at the end when Mulder shoots a Field Trip, when Mulder shoots Skinner and that green substance comes out of him. And I thought that kind of maybe represented Skinner's dual allegiance. He's sort of two things, and his lack of allegiance sort of being prefigured. And that comes right before the Biogenesis trilogy. So I was thinking that was sort of, foreshadowing what happened in Skinner's decision-making in the Biogenesis trilogy. All of that was sort of the green blood and the hybridization motif, and sort of experimentation gone awry. But since I'm on Field Trip, I'll finish that and say that I also thought other things that are sort of mythology related and these are just sort of, I think, fun trivia. Wallace Schiff, the character Wallace Schiff, the man he and his wife are kidnapped, reminds me a lot of Alex Krychek.
Oh, really?
The actor himself, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A little connection. And then, of course, I love Mulder and Scully's kind of mind meld and thought that prefigured Mulder's clairvoyance in the Biogenesis trilogy.
Oh, okay.
So that was a lot. That was a bit of a ramble there, but those are I Want to Believe and Field Trip going back to the hybridization idea and the visuals of that.
With visual, too, I had written down just the color green as kind of a signifier of something that's alien. The alien ships are kind of lit green, it's an unnatural glow that kind of, it's in the tanks and Erlenmeyer flasks. So kind of the visual filming style that when that color shows up, it kind of signifies an alien sort of environment.
And I would also connect to just the theme of hybridization. You could connect a non-mythology like chimera, because that's what chimera means. Yeah. It's half one thing and half the other thing. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of what we were just talking about a person's dual nature, and what you said about Skinner. That's a really interesting point. How the audience knows a little more, the viewer knows a little bit more about Skinner than Mulder and Scully really know. And so Mulder and Scully not always, but often go back to, they're not really sure if Skinner is completely on their side. So yeah, that idea of shooting Skinner and the green substance, yeah, it really does call back to, the mythology.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's kind of interesting, too. I never really thought about it, but, like, Mulder, in order to demonstrate to Scully that they're not in the real world, like, he chooses to shoot Skinner in the chest. Like, what if it actually hadn't been? Like, is that, like, kind of a subconscious coming through, like, he still doesn't trust him? And so that definitely could have gone awry if it actually wasn't.
That's true. That was not would not have been without consequence. Deana, did you have a third one?
Yeah, my third one. So this is the theme of genetic engineering. This is a long one because it seems like there's actually a couple of different themes within that topic, and certainly the mythology. I mean, it's a huge part of the mythology. Just the idea of creating the alien-human hybrid is this. It's this whole 50-year genetic experiment that they're trying to get to the hybrid. I mean, one of the big things about this is just the timeliness of when the X-Files came out, when it started, because it was, I mean, the Human Genome Project started in 1990, and in the Erlenmeyer Flask, they actually, when they mentioned, I think it's the Erlenmeyer Flask, when they mentioned the Human Genome Project, they actually explained to the viewer, like, what it is. It's sort of a contrast from now, where like you definitely would not have to do that now. I mean, now you can send your you can send your DNA sample to 23andMe, and they'll let you know whether you have the polymorphism that makes you possibly not like cilantro.
That's true. Yeah, like we're all participating in it now, willingly.
And back then, yeah, right. And back then it was like, no, we have to actually explain what this is. And it was in the 1990s that just DNA testing in general became a little bit more available to do by laboratories, by criminal investigations, stuff like that, because the equipment and the reagents were just becoming more available. So you hear Scully request PCR like all the time, not all the time, but a lot. And I just wrote down like the first court case in which, at least in the United States, in which DNA evidence was used was in 1985. And in the 1990s, like the public became a little more aware of it. So anyway, the first episode where this is really investigated would be Eve. So the whole idea of the Litchfield experiments where they created the atoms and the Eves, the stories they gave them, they have 10 extra chromosomes, so they have extra copies. They have 2 extra copies of each of 5 chromosomes, and that's supposed to give them extra strength, extra intelligence, but had this side effect of also psychosis. They're prone to suicide, they're prone to murder. And it's very into the public ideas of genetic experimentation, genetic engineering in the 90s, because they're talking about in vitro fertilization and fears about that. And so Sally Kendrick, who was one of the Eves, it turns out that she was cloning herself using these couples who were seeking in vitro fertilization. With that sort of background, there's 2 things that come up, and this is starting in Eve, and they sort of come through. One thing is this idea of genetic determinism or biological determinism. Sally Kendrick, she kidnaps the 2 girls, and they're sitting in the hotel room, and she's explaining to them, you don't have to live out your genetic destiny. You don't have to be a murderer. You can become like me. You can do these whatever behavioral modifications and medications or whatever, and like be a normal person. And of course, they poison her. But that idea of biological determinism comes up a lot in the whole show. Like a lot of the mutants. This is something that Tony just wrote about on the blog. Talked about the host, about how the host is just sort of living out his biological imperative. This is what he does to survive. But then you get to like Hungry, where you see this monster does have the biological imperative, but actually feels remorse and wants to be more human. So like that's sort of an interesting thing. So in addition to genetic determinism, there's also this idea of, we were talking about doubles, doppelgangers, like clones are like sort of in that same genre. When they visit Eve 6, she says, they ask her about Sally Kendrick, and she says, she is me and I am her and we are all together. Mm-hmm. So it's like, what is the relationship between the original and the clone? So that you can take to, the many clones of Samantha that you see in the mythology. And do they just look like her, or is there anything else that they sort of inherited? Any personality tendencies, whatever, is that in her DNA? In Herrenvolk, the clones have no language, no emotion. But in other mythology, like in Colony and Endgame and in Memento Mori, you have these clones who are actually they're doing experiments and trying to subvert the project. There's that one great scene in Memento Mori, Mulder finds the lab where all of the clones show him the drawers of all the human ova and explain what's going on. Mulder says, oh, you're trying to save these women. And he says there are mothers. I always found that interesting because the project is really, a lot of it is trying to build these clones that are just going to be workers and have no emotion. And in these particular clones, at least, they could not engineer out their human capacity for love or their connection to their biological mothers, which was like this really comforting thing.
Like that empathy is still there.
And I sort of want, just as like a side note, because you see them and you see the Samantha clones and you wonder which, was this one of the Syndicate's family members? Is this a clone of one of the Syndicate's family members? I wonder who it is.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, yeah, as I said, this is sort of a long one. So that's Eve.
It's interesting, too, with what you were saying about the capacity for empathy and that they have emotion, because when he says there are mothers, what you just said reminded me of the part in Herrenvolk when they talk about parenting being unnecessary and being an unnecessary use of resources, I think is what they say, something like that.
Yeah, and that was sort of a break-in, and it actually reminds me of what Katie was saying in The Unnatural about Exley saying how, my people don't have, we don't have the capacity to smile, we don't laugh, we don't have fun. Yeah, that's sort of interesting. So another idea of genetic manipulation, so this is like separate from me, this is just sort of like a little bit of a through line, but it involves postmodern Prometheus. So I'm going to start with Paperclip. So in Paperclip, they go visit Victor Klemper, one of the Nazi scientists. They're in his greenhouse with all his flowers, all his orchids, and the well-manicured man, sort of alludes to the orchids being hybrids. He creates the most beautiful hybrids. And it's this really interesting contrast between these flowers that were crossbred in this very sort of basic DIY, handmade way of genetic manipulation, which humans have been doing forever, of just crossbreeding. The flowers are created like just to create something beautiful. They're very innocuous and beautiful, contrasted with this project, which with a horrendous human cost to create an alien human hybrid, and as opposed to a hybrid of two different color orchids. And this, in real life, this comes up too. You have these like the more traditional ways of manipulating genetics and the more technological ways, which occasionally are interpreted as scary. So this even came up in, recently here in the U.S. with how the FDA was deciding how to label genetically engineered foods, which I am going somewhere with this, which everybody sort of knows as GMOs, genetically modified organisms, but that's not really accurate. It's too vague, because even crossbreeding is manipulating the genetics. So humans are always intervening in the genetics of other organisms and their own. So in postmodern Prometheus, you have this sort of comic booky mad scientist character who is creating fruit flies with legs growing out of their abdomen, legs growing out of their heads, or whatever it is, for no real discernible reason other than he says, because I can. Mulder and Scully have this conversation, and Mulder says, well, why do these experiments at all? And Scully says, to unlock the mysteries of genetics, etc. And so Mulder says, but given the power, who could resist the temptation to create life in his own image? And Scully says, well, we already have that ability, Mulder. It's called procreation. Which is very interesting that she says that. And one thing, it shows you this point that everyone who has a child does a small amount of genetic engineering just by choosing their mate. So there's that, which to me sort of calls back to the flowers. But also, it's very interesting that Scully says that, because this is right before Christmas Carol and Emily, where she tells her mother that actually she has lost that ability. She's not able to get pregnant, so she's actually not able to. And then, even further than that, to an even greater degree, she's lost that ability when you get to the Williams story, with the implication that this is a genetically engineered hybrid or some sort of super being child placed in her body without her consent or even her knowledge. So she's really lost that ability to manipulate the genetics of the human race the way just a normal person can do in their own little way.
I guess like that's one of the moments or the times with the postmodern Prometheus that it seems like intentional or not, the theme really is going into what turns out to be the mythology later on as well, and seems to be sort of the most consistent in a thematic way, if not in a plot way.
Yeah, I like too how you said like creating something beautiful with the flowers is so opposite of doing these horrendous experiments that result in like the test subjects have horrible deformities, they die, they get cancer when they but in the end their goal is to create this like beautiful being. Like Cassandra is like the perfect representation. It's something that the process of getting to it is horrific, but they're aiming for this higher goal in their mind that is beautiful.
I think it's interesting too. I'm not sure if this completely connects, but I think it's interesting that like the scene in the greenhouse, it's an innocent setting, and it kind of goes with what you're saying about creating beauty, kind of in contrast with all the other experimental settings that we that are usually fairly horrific. And then also, and I could totally be wrong, I'll probably have to edit this part out, but with some genetic modifications, isn't what would be a side effect or sort of like a side result what is the goal? I mean, you're kind of like creating something pure, but it's like to get a different color, to get something else that's not natural, but it's almost like a side effect, whereas the side effects in the human experiments are often what is killing the people or like giving Scully cancer or like branching the DNA or whatever. It just seems like the difference in the goal is there too. It's like the things that are sort of marginalized or beautiful in some of the examples that are done for a pure purpose. Does that make any sense at all?
A little, and actually, well, what you say about side effects is one of the interesting things, and that's just, and I think this comes up in all of any episode about this, is that you only have so much control over these experiments. You're manipulating maybe one or a few particular genes, but that always has some sort of domino effect on something. There's always some sort of side effect, and a lot of times, like in Eve, for example, the side effect is very dangerous and kills people.
Yeah, it's like nature is still going to take control a little bit.
Right, we have a limited amount of control. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could even take that through. I mean, you can even take this through to my struggle too with the aliens were the ones who actually found CRISPR.
Yeah.
In the news stories about, I mean, I don't know how familiar people are with this, but in the news stories about CRISPR, one of the things lately has been what are some of the off-target effects, because you're manipulating one gene in particular. But there's always going to be some sort of side effect, and it's about measuring that out and figuring out how to minimize the unwanted ones.
Yeah, and like how can you even predict it until it happens, and then you're kind of stuck with the consequences.
Right. Yeah. So sort of who knows with all the women who took the chips out of their necks and then ended up with cancer. Was that like a side effect, or was it that they just like they didn't expect anybody to actually take the chips out? I always wondered about that. What was the purpose? Did they really mean to kill those women, or was that an unwanted side effect?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too. If that was something they thought they would just never discover that they had these chips in them, and they'd be able to track them and so forth.
Right. Or like once they did discover it, then they're sort of on to the project, and then they have to be kind of done away with, so that's the consequence of learning about your situation.
Right. And I guess if you take the chip out, then maybe they can't track you and they can't abduct you again. Like if you just left it, they just keep abducting you over and over.
Yeah, that seems like it. This is like way left field, but there's sort of that compromise between freedom and safety and security that runs through the show too.
Yeah.
I think with that, like, are you going to let somebody take care of you but control you, or are you going to sort of be free but risk your own life because of it?
Oh yeah, that is that's interesting.
It kind of follows like the tracking with all the smallpox vaccines, and supposedly it's for the greater good.
Okay, well, do you have anything else on that?
Oh no, that's everything.
Why don't I do one more, and then we can talk about Jose Chung, and then maybe you can lead that, and I can do Hollywood AD, and we'll have those sort of as the two episode, not parody, but that type of thing, discussion.
Yeah.
Okay. So another theme from later in the show that I thought about was this idea of sort of like a normal family and a normal community life. In my mind, that goes to the whole like the safety and security versus freedom idea as well that runs through the show. And then also to me relates to the syndicate giving up their own relatives. So it was like members of their family to start with that they gave up for experimentation. And then it sort of spread, in their various projects, both within the mythology and in a lot of the, related standalone episodes into the populace, but it started with their own family. So that aspect of it, of like the normal family maybe not being as ideal in some situations as one might like to hope. Mm-hmm. And then with that, Mulder's kind of false fantasy of a normal life in Amor Fati. So I was thinking about the episodes that were occurring at that time, and the first one that came to mind is the Dreamland 1 and 2. And Scully even, there's the conversation when they're driving, and it's kind of funny, and it's kind of... Scully's a little bit put out, and she talks about, like, don't you ever want to stop the car and have a normal life? And I think Mulder says he doesn't he say he doesn't know what he'd be missing or something to that effect? Mm-hmm. Or he doesn't even know what that is?
Yeah, something like that.
And so the whole thing is this absurd comedy then about Morris Fletcher living Mulder's life and finding this haven from his so-called normal life that he had, and Mulder being in that, kind of everyday scenario in a way and finding it unbearable, and maybe that's not the ideal. So the Dreamlands, and then in How the Ghost Stole Christmas, Scully's kind of pretending to want a normal Christmas. I mean, she's super cranky about it, but she's talking about, like, she has this family roll call and she's wrapped the presents and so forth. So there's this, like, whole attempt to do things in a normal way. And in terms of endearment, Wayne Winesider wants a normal baby. He doesn't want he keeps having the demon babies, but he wants a normal baby. Arcadia is about this ideal community, but it has this dark underbelly, and everyone's trying to follow the rules to be safe and protected. I would even say Milagro has this like underlying ideal of a specific type of relationship that might not necessarily be the ideal relationship for everybody, but that's kind of in there. And Chimera has that in season 7, this sort of ideal family idea, and the community again has that sort of like rotten undercore going on to it. And then even going down to just Sweat, Jenn the genie wants this ordinary life that she doesn't have. So I don't know, to me it seems like there's a lot of stuff about like what is a normal family and what is a normal life, and is that worth changing yourself for, or should you accept the life that you have and just live that? Looking at those episodes, I don't know, that's kind of what I take from it. And then along with that, this kind of insider-outsider theme that related to the syndicate being a fairly insular group, and then again the idea of them giving away their own family members for experimentation. And I was thinking about a lot of the standalone episodes in which it is not necessarily the outsider that is the victim or punished, but the insider that lets the outsider in. And that happens, I watched Home recently, and I was thinking about that with that. Like, it's not Mulder and Scully that the Peacock brothers attack, it's the sheriff that sort of let in this outside influence. And I feel like that's kind of the case in a lot of the sort of those sorts of standalone episodes too. So that's a little convoluted, but it's just like that idea of what is the inner circle and what is the normal family and community.
Yeah, that does go like through a ton of episodes. I think probably even more than you mentioned too. And yeah, that's like such a big theme throughout.
Well, especially Scully's expectation or desire for a normal life is definitely a through line through the entire series. And because Mulder never really had an expectation of a normal life, as much as he's always trying to, like, reunite his family. I mean, starting as early as, like, Jersey Devil, you have Scully choosing between, do I do this normal life thing and, like, go out on a few dates with this really boring guy? Or do I go chase monsters with Mulder? But the thing is, she always chooses chasing monsters with Mulder. She sort of longs for a normal life, but she always chooses Mulder. And the whole family thing, the normal family thing with Mulder is kind of interesting because his family is they're not really warm and loving. It's always tense. Like whenever he's speaking to his mother or his father, like in the first couple seasons, it's always like weird and tense, and it's not this warm, loving family. Actually, that's why I think in Fight the Future, there's like this one little scene of the well-manicured man like looking out on his lawn at his grandkids, which I think is like sort of a powerful scene because he's the only one really in the syndicate that you've ever seen have a positive family relationship.
Yeah, like an outside life, even.
Yeah, like an outside life. Like the smoking man, talks about how he never loved Cassandra. he shoots Jeffrey Spender. I mean, it's a mess. Like, Mulder's whole family is like, they're not warm and loving, but the well-manicured man does seem to just have that little bit of desire for normal family.
Like he seems the most he can become detached if he needs to.
Yeah.
And like Mulder's family too, it's like this ideal he has in his head, but it's not true. I don't think his family ever was real happy, or it's like that glossed over kind of version he's thinking of. If Samantha was returned, then it could go back to that, but like it never really was that to begin with. Like just looking back at Demons, like all of his kind of memory regression, that this was not a normal American family household.
Right. And I think even in Amor Fati, when he is living that sort of dream life, Samantha is there. She's already bought into that world, at least however we see that being in his mind. There's no sense that I can tell of disappointment in that. He's just like pleased to see her. But I think that kind of goes through that idea that it's not ideal, and even she's not ideal. And this ideal he has of finding her, even if that were to happen, she's not going to be what he expects or what he hopes for.
Yeah, and actually it's sort of interesting what you said about Dreamland, because you could sort of contrast Dreamland to Amor Fati. Amor Fati being this sort of idealized, although not really, and Dreamland being sort of real family life.
Yeah, like the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, that's true. Katie, did you want to start the Jose Chung bit and just say whatever you have to say about it?
It's like an episode that sort of turns like a mythology story on its head. Like it includes so many of the elements. It has the gray aliens, abduction, men in black, the military, UFOs, the cars stopping when the UFO comes in, hypnosis. But it just ends up being, is that true? Is it not true? I read a lot of Darren Mooney's reviews in getting ready for this, and like the whole idea of alienation, like the search for aliens, it's like a human alienation as well as like a whole, like an allegory that goes through. So you can search to find that meaning, you can search to find the other, what's out there. Mulder's search to find the aliens and the truth, but it kind of brings it back to, he never really finds that big broad goal. He finds himself. He's not alone. Like the ending of Jose Chung is on this planet. We're all alone. It makes you think. The ending of it, searching for meaning in other human beings, you're rare or lucky if you find that. So do you want to keep that broad search going out in the, the blackness of space, or do you want to try and find that at home? So that's kind of what I liked about Jose Chung, that it turns that search for the truth on its head. And like in the end, Jose Chung says, at the beginning, he says, how can he ever, tell the truth, because there's so many different versions and no one ever really knows what's happened.
I like that it's a story within a story, too. I don't know that the mythology had developed that bent yet in the show, but I think it certainly does later on. So this is like another example of a Darren Morgan episode that, wittingly or not, formed some sort of pattern for the way that the mythology story was told, just like you were discussing with the bees coming from, in a way sort of paralleling the cockroaches and the panic or the coprophages.
Well, like it uses the pieces. Scully says the girl's story it's way too typical of an abduction. Like it uses all the general knowledge pieces of that then the X-Files, like it does use throughout its mythology storyline.
And your point on alienation, it sort of speaks to Mulder as a character, because it's like his search for aliens or the search for what happened to his sister really isolated him. That's what got him into the basement office by himself.
That's a good point, too. But also with that, though, because I started thinking when you said that about how, we talk about Darren Morgan lampooning Mulder in a way and making him seem sort of like this, I don't want to say buffoonish, because I don't think it's that unkind, but this sort of character that's more on the margin than we normally see him. But at the same time, in Jose Chung, I see the alienation parallel, but at the same time, Mulder's not sitting in his bedroom looking at his posters and playing fantasy games and so forth. Like, he is actually doing something in the world to find truth. Like, he has a job. He's not looking to go to another planet to not have a job. So I think that there's that sense that he is still on a quest of some sort, as much as he might be alienated. So that's like a character relationship thing, I think, that's interesting.
But I wonder how much would he have spiraled into that if like Scully hadn't shown up to help him with that quest too. Like, would he be in the basement with his like door just locked all the time? And
yeah, and actually that sort of goes into the Mulder we see in I Want to Believe. Is he's just sort of in his own head, and in his office with all the conspiracy stuff taped to the wall.
Yeah, he's living that kind of hermit lifestyle.
And he's cataloging his failures at that point as well, and just kind of waiting for Scully to come and talk to him or whatever.
At least they're alien. The two of them, I mean, a lot of the show is, the two of them are isolated and alienated, but at least they're together. Isolated and alienated.
Yeah, but they kind of they get out into the world and do something, I guess, too. And I think that part of the end of Jose Chung, when we talk about the meaning of these events for different people, is interesting. Because for Harold, it is finding meaning in other people, but then for some of the other characters, for Chrissy Giorgio, it's this cause she has to save the planet. And then kind of make fun of Mulder for having the chasing aliens being a 9-to-5 job and so forth. Oh, no, that's Scully. And then was it Raynard Muldrake? It was so warped that he's a ticking time bomb or whatever. So that's not entirely a positive presentation, but just the way that the story affects these different characters and motivations in different ways too. And that's also the viewership of the X-Files kind of goes like that too. I'll watch something and I'll read what somebody else has to say about that same scene and be like, how did they get that from it?
Yeah, it lends itself to being interpreted so many different ways.
I'm going back a little bit, but you could sort of parallel Chrissy to Mulder a little bit, because this idea of taking this traumatic experience and using it as motivation to do something positive with it. So Chrissy's idea of saving the planet, and like you said about Mulder, he's not exactly just sitting in the basement staring at the walls. He took the traumatic experience with his sister, and even though other people don't understand him and he's sort of isolated within the FBI, he's actually doing things. He's solving cases. He's doing something good in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that's exactly right. I was thinking that too, about him doing something good in the world. And, I think there's, we talk a lot sometimes about him being sort of centered on himself and his own trauma. But I think that his aim truly is to do something good in the world. And that's kind of what her aim was in Jose Chung as well. So I think that's a good parallel. I wanted to bring up Hollywood AD as a standalone that is its own story, but it's a spoof of Amor Fati. So you have the Lazarus Bowl movie being the spaceship in Africa and the piece of the spaceship and these sort of magical properties that emanate from it. And then the zombies coming back to life to sing and dance and so forth as the positive spin on the zombies in the Sixth Extinction that came back to life in the presence of the rubbing or the piece of the artifact, the ship, and killed Dr. Barnes, for example. But the same idea of this power to raise the dead. I think there's also this idea in the episode of choosing to live in freedom. So you have Micah Hoffman versus Cardinal O'Fallon within that, and Micah Hoffman talking about he had this revelation, what was it, the forgeries that it was wrong to make these forgeries, and then he talked about Cardinal O'Fallon not believing in man's ability to choose to live in freedom, and that sort of went back to Mulder's kind of false fantasy world, I thought, versus choosing his real life in Amor Fati. And then there's also, I've thought about this for years because it's almost a throwaway reference, but I really think there's something to it. When Mulder and Scully are sitting on his couch and Mulder is talking about Hoffman's Jesus to O'Fallon's Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, and Scully says, how about Hoffman's Roadrunner to O'Fallon's Wile E. Coyote? I think it's a funny reference, and you can just kind of take it as her being silly or whatever. But there's also this idea, I think, of this entity that can't be pinned down. So you say idea that you're never fully knowing the truth. And it might be an actual truth, but it's always a roadrunner is it's a specific bird, but it's darting around everywhere, dropping anvils on your head, and you can't really pin it down. And so Scully talking. Yeah, exactly. And it kind of goes with the fun way that episode presented, I think, all of these larger ideas. It was very seriously done in Amor Fati, and I think that Hollywood AD sort of spoofs that and turns it on its head a little bit. I appreciated that aspect of the episode sort of as time went on. I don't think I saw that the first time, but then, over the years, I think I got more out of it, seeing how that connected to the earlier mythology.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have, I didn't really think of that before, but when you laid the pieces out,
there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and it seems really blatantly, really explicit now that you mention it, but I never thought of it before, of the pieces of the Lazarus Bowl and the pieces of the spaceship. The pieces of the spaceship sort of create that sound in Mulder's ears that incapacitates him, and there's a lot there. And the Wile E. Coyote thing, I mean, yeah, you could even think of Mulder and the Smoking Man as like these two cartoon characters, and like no matter what happens, you can't kill either one of them. Neither one of them can die. Drop an anvil, explode the mountain, doesn't matter. Ball of fire.
Yeah, it's like that nemesis is always
Mulder
out there.
Mulder was buried alive, or not buried alive. He was dead and buried, and somehow still came back to life. I mean,
Right.
Yeah, it's like the perpetual, the chase, good and evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I have one other thing I'm going to mention to see what you all think, because I don't know that it's necessarily, again, like with the, is it the writer's intent or the director's intent, or is it just something that happened because we've watched these episodes so many times that we happen to connect back. I wanted to connect something with the revival episodes too, so I think that this one fits, and it's from this. In the end of the episode, toward the end of the episode, when Mulder and Scully go back through the tunnel when they're in the Long Lines building, and they find the conference room where Mulder had been talking to Erica Price completely empty. All the, the ambiance, the creepy ambiance has been removed. The artwork has been removed. It's deserted. And so Mulder is showing Scully that because he was there with Erica Price. And that reminded me of the scene in Naomi when Scully takes Mulder back to the cigarette smoking man's deserted office and goes in and there's nothing there.
Oh, that is really similar.
Yeah. Like a kind of character and visual callback.
Erlenmeyer Flats, too, when they go back to the warehouse and it's totally cleaned out. And there's always this evidence that Mulder's seeing or that Scully's seeing, and the other one doesn't get to experience it.
Yeah, that was the other one, too. Like, right after that, Scully had been in the room with the server, and, Mulder came in there at the end, but she was the one that deactivated the server, and then when they go back, it's all stripped out of the walls and everything, just like when Mulder goes to show Scully the tanks and the Erlenmeyer flask, and they've been removed.
Or Fight the Future at the end of that, Did you see a spaceship or didn't you see a spaceship?
I liked both of those references, and I like that it sort of switched the two characters around as to, him showing her something and her showing him something that visually paralleled what had happened in the original series, but switched them around.
I like that. Because it was always kind of like, Scully's never the one to see the evidence, I like that it subverts that. And
then Scully saw, the servers. It was that was, the big project. Just like with the Erlenmeyer flasks. That was the big project that they were discovering. And then they go back and it's gone. So it kind of called that back as well.
Now that you mentioned, I've got one more for the revival. It's just sort of with the genetic engineering theme. I mean, obviously, Founder's Mutation fits in with the genetic engineering theme. But the idea of biological or genetic determinism, it fits William's story in the revival. About how, he sort of sees the future and sees his role in it, and he basically is resigned to the idea that he can't change it. So, he tries to get the smoking man to kill him because that's the only way he thinks he can remove his role in the destruction of all humans, which was his genetic destiny.
Right. Or what he considered, or what he thought, I guess, his genetic destiny was.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought there was a lot, too, this is probably could go on to another topic, a lot, too, about, genetic and biological determinism, just in terms of family relationships as well, and what that meant, that had to do with parentage and things of that sort, leading into, is the future going to be determined by whether or not someone is a biological child, or anything like that?
Yeah, that is an interesting topic, though. Yeah, it's probably a long one. You look at the fact that both Fox Mulder and Jeffrey Spender became FBI agents. That's sort of interesting from the biological determinism point of view.
Yeah, without having any knowledge of what their father had done before. It just ended up that way, yeah.
I'm going to go over a few listener mailbag comments for this.
Oh, cool.
Anything else comes up comment-wise, we can do that, and then we'll wrap up.
Sounds good.
Michael Little says, he goes back to Field Trip, and he says it's sort of a mythological and standalone hybrid, mainly in the sense that it's a standalone that examines the core foundations of the entire series. And I really like that. I think that we touched on some of the visual ways in the themes, but I think that's interesting that he talks about it being an examination of the foundation of the series as well.
Yeah.
Adam Silva comments on that to say that I would argue that Field Trip fits the quasi-mythology category. So it uses mythology elements and characters, but isn't really a Mytharc story at all. Which is, that's true. If there was no mythology whatsoever, I think it would stand on its own as a story. It just wouldn't have all those reference points.
Right, like in the Vision, Mulder has an alien in his house. Like that's kind of his end goal is to have that proof.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It fits the whole buried and unearthed theme, too.
Definitely.
Andrew Levitt says, you could say that Jose Chung's From Outer Space has mythology elements that takes the show's core, the search for the truth, and turns it on a head in a fun gonzo way, which is exactly what Katie was talking about earlier. And then Jocelyn Rojas says that ice has the idea of the worm's blood being black oil. So it's black oil, or it can be suggested as a form of black oil in an organism that's capable of controlling its host. And she says it's very predictive of the black oil storyline pre-season 8. And I love that, because I think that's not necessarily a mythology, like a precursor episode in the sense that some of the, like Eve, like we were talking about, or Fallen Angel, or some of those that have like a more specific genetic or alien storyline are predictive, but just the visual and the idea of an organism controlling another organism, controlling its host.
And the implication that it's an alien controlling the host, which is exactly what the black oil does.
Mm-hmm. And then she also mentions Eve, like you all were talking about, and said that the Litchfield experiment is based on the boys from Brazil. The theory that Nazis were creating kids with Hitler's DNA, all of which is allegorical to the alien-human hybrids gone awry. And that goes back to what you're saying about the idea of hybridization not failing, but like there's some side effect or something happens that's not supposed to happen, going back to Eve. So I thought that was really interesting too.
Yeah, that is interesting. And actually the worm in ice and the black oil, it's sort of like, just as a connection to real life stuff, and it's only like a faint connection, is today you hear some stories now about like the gut-brain axis and how the composition of the gut microbiome can maybe affect things going on in the brain. And of course that's like, it's exaggerated, if you read about it a little bit, but you can draw like a little bit of a connection there.
Yeah, like there's another controlling force involved.
Right. That doesn't have to be like inserted or physically placed in the body anymore. A lot of the episodes, not all, like there's some that have to do, like I think of Blood and Wet Wired being more like outside signals, but it's affecting neurobiology, obviously. But then a lot of the other episodes of that time have to do with some sort of physical mechanism by which that's done. And then looking at the microbiome, like it's not somebody like putting something into you.
Yeah, but it's still other and yet part of you at the same time.
Okay, well, if we are just for this moment finished with this discussion that could go on forever, where can we find you all online?
This is Deana. I am on Twitter. I am Deana Butter, which is all one word, peanut butter, but with a D. And of course in the X-Files basement every now and then too, on Facebook.
Yep, same thing. I'm in the basement. I try to be there more than I am because it's a really great group. Also on Twitter, I don't tweet that much, but I follow a lot of X-Files people. I'm Designer Doe on there.
And I am Marlene MHS on Twitter, and then Marlene Stemme on Facebook, where I pretty much only post in the XCast basement group now and go around to see what everyone's discussing there. So that's a great group of interesting people with really insightful things to say about the X-Files.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you both, Katie and Deana, for participating in this and having this excellent conversation with me. And thanks everyone for listening. As always, trust no one.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at The Xcast, and on Facebook if you type in The Xcast, or at our group, X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support the Xcast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/The Xcast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our Patron Roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/The Xcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at IamWillAYE.